Welcome to the Get Real Movies podcast. My name is Daniel Chadwick Schubat. I'm your host, and today's episode is another one in our series Independent Film Focus. Today we shift the focus and talk about a documentary named The Spoils. We get to speak to the director of the documentary, Jamie Kastner, about a film that deals with the contemporary controversies surrounding the restitution of Nazi-looted art, specifically the story of Dr. Max Stern, a German Jewish dealer who fled to Montreal during World War II and went on to become one of Canada's most influential figures in the art world. The restitution project in his name is now considered the most successful of its kind worldwide. This film was one that I was not aware of, and I got to see a screener a few weeks back, and I had the profound pleasure to interview Jamie live. And it was definitely my first interview in person on this podcast since we restarted it, and Jamie was very gracious with his time, and a few technical difficulties happened, but I'm really excited to present this interview with Jamie and talking about not only this film, but his past in documentary filmmaking. He's from a filmmaking family and was just really wonderful to talk to. So without much further ado, here's my conversation with the director of The Spoils, Jamie Kastner. And now it's my pleasure to welcome Jamie Kastner to the show. Jamie, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Daniel.
Yeah, thank you so much. I saw The Spoils this past weekend, and I really loved it. I want to first off say congrats.
Thank you.
I grew up in Europe. My mom was Belgian, and my Oma grew up under the Nazi occupation. So this is something that I've always been really interested in, and I think the medium of film is how I've always kind of learned about it. And two of the movies that you reference early on in the movie, The Woman in Gold and The Monuments Men, I think are great examples of just how this problem wasn't something that was solved in World War II, 1945. As soon as the Allies declared victory, our problems weren't over. It was really the beginning of many of these things. So I'd love it if you tell people a little bit about The Spoils and about what attracted you to this project and kind of discovering the crazy story that goes up to a few years ago.
Yes, indeed. Sure. Well, The Spoils it's a feature documentary about contemporary scandals surrounding the restitution of Nazi-looted art. And it specifically focuses on the collection of Max Stern, who was a German Jewish dealer who was forced to liquidate his family gallery in Dusseldorf in 1937 in a Nazi-approved Jew auction, as they were known, and give the proceeds to the Nazis in order to secure exit visas for himself and his mother. He wound up in Canada during the war and sort of started afresh from nothing with nothing and grew to become the country's largest or most important art dealer. He launched the careers, or was deeply involved in the early careers of people like Emily Carr and Jean-Paul Riopel. He was the Canadian dealer for Henry Moore and Rodin, and he was a major force in the Montreal and Canadian art scene. And a project in his name, run by his heirs, which are three universities, he had no kids, has become the most successful art restitution effort in the world. And the film, which was made over about a 4-year process, chronicles two of the Max Stern restitution project's attempts to reclaim paintings that are currently in Dusseldorf, and two botched attempts to honor Max Stern in exhibitions in Dusseldorf. And in the details of these stories, these stories reveal the larger ongoing brawl about restitution of Nazi-looted art that is very much alive, well, and raging to this day. And I knew nothing about this. To answer your second question, I knew nothing about this before getting involved in this project. I made a previous film in 2019 in the art world, the only other thing I've done in the art world as a subject, called There Are No Fakes, about what has since been revealed to be the world's largest art fraud scam surrounding the work, or the purported work, I should say, of the legendary Indigenous painter Norval Morisseau. And that film also contains a brawl at its core. And a journalist, academic friend of mine named Sarah Angel, who had been covering the Max Stern story for some of the papers and for her PhD thesis, got in touch with me and said, having seen There Are No Fakes, and said, I have another story that would be up your alley. And she was absolutely right. So from having been introduced to the head of the by Sarah to the head of the Max Stern Restitution Project, Clarence Epstein, it kind of proceeded from there. My company got development money from CBC, and I began trying to get the other side in this brawl to agree to participate. And initially, that was out of the gate. I landed 2 of the important interviews. I knew that you couldn't have a film without both sides. My films are often journalistically rooted, and I believe it's a stronger mode of telling this kind of story. In fact, I can't imagine how it would sustain if you only had one side. It would just be a boring polemic. So actually, my first interviews out of the gate were with someone I would characterize, although he may not characterize himself this way, as an anti-restitution lawyer, Ludwig von Pufendorf, a Berlin lawyer. And
great name.
I didn't make it up. And the then mayor of Düsseldorf, Thomas Geisel, both of whom were key players in one of the scandals in the film.
Yeah, and one of the things that really struck me, especially about the mayor, Pufendorf to an extent as well, is almost how Machiavellian they appear just by their own words. When you ask questions, and I think it was you interviewing them,
yes,
right? When you ask them questions, the dodging that kind of became apparent, it was quite crazy to watch on the screen, and it was quite interesting listening to you, because you were like, no, but you've gone to another topic now, can you answer my question? And I think that even though you're showing both sides, I think that definitely does a service to this film, because seeing both sides, you sort of learn where the motives are. But how important was it for you when you were interviewing these people to kind of go into it with a clear and open mind? Because I know that's something you said, bringing up both sides is very important to you. So how important was it for you to go into it? Because for me, I feel as though I would be too biased to sort of be objective in this case.
I mean, I think that nobody individually is truly objective. I mean, we all have our biases. But this is my 10th feature doc. I was a print journalist before that. Journalism is at the root of everything I do. I'm long trained in this craft, and you put your biases aside and do your job, basically, when you're conducting these interviews. And I think it's also necessary to make your job also in interviews is also, as you probably know, to draw people out and get them to relax and reveal themselves. And so, there are different styles of these things. You mentioned the interview with Mayor Geisel, which probably got the tetchiest. I mean, I'm not setting out to do gotcha interviews, confrontational interviews in this film, but that one in particular, I guess, got a little bit scratchy. I mean, it's interesting to see who did and who didn't agree to speak on the record, and when and why. And I think in the case of Pufendorf and Geisel, both of them are very confident, outspoken, public figures who are professional politicians to one degree and another. I mean, Geisel is a mayor. I think Pufendorf, in addition to being a lawyer, has also held public office at different times. But they're supremely confident, not only in their point of view, but also in their ability to handle the joust that every interview is to one degree or another. And, over the course of the films I've made, I've had this form of joust with some formidable opponents, among them Pat Buchanan in a film I did that came out in 2007, basically cleaned the floor with me in an interview. He was a far right-wing politician, presidential candidate, and advisor to several presidents, who I tried to interview about basically his anti-Semitic writing in a film that I called Kike Like Me, which seemed like a good idea at the time. So I've tussled with the likes of Pat Buchanan, and it doesn't get, he was not the host but a regular on Crossfire for a decade at least. Like, this guy knows how to debate. So Mayor Geisel agreed to the interview, somewhat to my surprise, but to my great delight, because I knew I wouldn't have a film without him. But then he and his handlers put a very short time restriction on the interview, and they sat around me breathing down my neck while I interviewed him, and he very expertly and calmly and so it was a strict 20 minutes, and he expertly and calmly led the conversation off in a million different directions other than what I was obviously there to talk to him about. And I am, by nature, a polite Canadian person. It's not, my first line of action to get all confrontational, but eventually I saw what he was doing, and there was nothing for it but to kind of cut him off and try to cut to the quick.
Yeah. And running out of time, especially, when you're on these timelines, and I've had that before where it's like you see a message pop up and it's 5 minutes left and you're like, okay, I got to get the last question. And then the person you asked the question to, they don't answer it and tell this story, and you're happy about it, but you're also like, I wish I could have gotten that question.
Well, it's a sort of motto of political PR training. Answer the question you wish you were asked, not the question you were asked. So this is all part of the game of cat and mouse, particularly when you're dealing with politicians or lawyers or people like that who know the game inside and out, and you've got to calibrate, indeed, watching the clock with one wrist and figuring where you are and how civil you have to keep it for what amount of time to get what you need.
Appearing calm, but rushed without rushing almost.
In the Pat Buchanan interview, incidentally, he kicked me out of his house, but I got him to sign a release form on the way out the door. It's in the film. So I consider that one of my crowning. In what particular Olympic category, I'm not sure.
In the interview Olympic category, I guess. Yeah. I guess watching this film, one of the things that struck me is when I think of Germany, I do think of a country that has really done a lot in terms of coming to terms with their horrible history. I think it's one of the only places on planet Earth where Holocaust teaching is mandatory in high school. And something that I noticed when I moved to Canada is that there, especially in my age group and younger age groups, there's becoming less and less knowledge of what happened then.
Absolutely.
And that's why I think documentaries such as yourselves, but also feature films are really important.
I mean, I have been very fortunate in my career so far to be able to do stuff that I find interesting and meaningful and somehow manage to make a living doing it. It is one of my key objectives in anything. And what the historical element is the way in which history is being weaponized by two sides in a fight, both the history of the Nazi era in Germany writ large, and also the personal history of this individual, Max Stern. And this is, I just found it fascinating how it's like pick your Max Stern, pick your Nazis. Each side, yeah, and they're fighting over it, of course, because something of value right now is at stake. And another thing that emerges in this story, right, is that even if one painting in the Max Stern collection may not be that valuable in terms of dollars and cents, it's extremely important in terms of the legal precedent it's setting when it gets restituted or not. And that's why these factions continue turning up for these brawls, whether the painting at stake is large or small. So yes, I found it very interesting, to say the least, of how, for instance, in that section you're talking about, you have Herr Pufendorf, the lawyer, the anti-restitution lawyer, giving his own version of who Max Stern was and answering and interpreting, as lawyers will, the facts of Max Stern, of the fact that Max Stern made his own restitution claims during his lifetime as a kind of idealized, romanticized, a soft, gentle, unassuming Max Stern, who, this is Pufendorf's version of Stern in the movie, who just asked, kind of almost by the by, if perhaps anybody had seen any of his paintings lying around. That's kind of the Max Stern that Pufendorf would have you believe. And then you have, just parenthetically, one of the challenges of this documentary is that the protagonist is dead. So the story becomes about the way other people are speaking for him. And if you don't know, each one, how do you know who to believe? Hence, I put both sides out there and let the audience decide. This is obviously in complete contradiction to the way the Stern heirs, the Max Stern Foundation, the Max Stern Restitution Project, view what Max Stern did and what Max Stern was about. And then, indeed, as a bit of a punchline to that section, we access some audio recordings that Max Stern himself made during his lifetime, in which he tells you how he felt. Not that that seems to stop anyone, because the film closes, spoiler alert, doesn't really matter, with one of the opponents of restitution, Henry Hanstein, the heir to the Lempert's auction house, at which the forced Jew auction that liquidated Stern's family gallery took place in 1937. Now in its fourth or fifth generation, a thriving enterprise. Mr. Hanstein, still after restitutions have happened and the battles that we focused on are done, still clinging on to the notion that he has studied Max Stern's will very carefully and found that it mentioned nothing about restitution and that the estate is doing something wrong. They're all speaking for Max Stern. Yes, it's interesting.
I think one of my favorite lines from the documentary is, I'm trying to remember his name now, but he talks about how restitution is similar to if your car was stolen and a few years go by or a few months go by and you see your car, it's right in front of you and someone else is in it and you say, that's my car, that was stolen from me. And the person in it says, don't worry, I'm taking it in for regular oil changes. I'm looking after it, but don't worry about it. It's mine now. And I think the lesson that really stuck out to me about this film was the way that people perceive things being theirs, even if it was stolen from that other person. And the way that people perceive that is just such a difference. And those anti-restitution people, they perceive it as it was sold and, they got very little amount of money for it, but we don't remember how much money and we don't know how much it was worth then. So why do they have to get it back? It was bought for a price, even though Max never saw any of that money. So I guess you don't have to answer with your own personal opinion, but when you heard that sort of explanation, what was going through your mind talking to these people? Like for me, it was more like I wanted to shake them a little bit.
Well, it was, there were at the core of the restitution debates, there are both legal and moral issues. And the law in Germany is that if you have owned something, quote unquote, in good faith for 10 years or more, it belongs to you. What a handy law. And I think Germany, which in some regards, of course, has done an enormous amount in terms of reparations writ large and memorializing of the Holocaust and Holocaust education, all of which they deserve to be lauded for. In fact, if you ever want to appreciate how much Germany has done, just go to Poland. But the fact of the matter is, these are the kind of arguments that the lawyers and politicians, the opponents of restitution in this film, lean on heavily. But even they realize that there's a larger PR battle. They can't just lean on the law. There are obvious moral problems with that argument, and thus begins the haggling. And one of the arguments that is frequently made as to why work should not be restituted is that it's hanging in a public institution in Germany, for instance, and the public is getting to enjoy it. And if this Jewish claimant comes and takes back their forebears' property, it'll just be sold at auction at Christie's and disappear into private collections. This is, one of the arguments, public versus private. And these kind of things, when you're wading into this issue of restitution afresh, as I was, they don't sound totally without merit as a broad argument. It's not a cut and dry issue. There are, what do you do with something so many generations later? It's not necessarily obvious, and it is kind of fascinating, sort of devil in the details. And to that extent, to respond to your earlier question, I do go into it open to being convinced one way or another. I have my preconceptions, let's say, even after the development period and I start production, but I'm open to being convinced truly in any conversation I have on the matter. So those are the kind of arguments that are being made. And then Willy Korte steps in. This is the main researcher, investigator for the Max Stern Restitution Project. He's a German guy who has long lived in DC. And parenthetically, this is another thing I liked about this project, is that the battle lines were not obviously drawn. It wasn't German versus Jew or German versus Canadian. It wasn't exclusively any of that. Yeah. There are Germans in this film who have completely opposing views on this matter and are at loggerheads over it. To it, Willie Korte and Pufendorf, for instance. So anyway, Willie kind of gives this argument they're referring to, what if someone stole your car? And I mean, I just couldn't help but chuckle. Yes, I'm doing my job, but I am only human, at the way in which it cuts right through the opposing argument, doesn't it? I mean, you're not talking about, semi-abstract notions of the public good, whatever that means, whoever the public is, whoever the German state is, whoever the board of such and such hypothetical museum might be, and what they and their forebears did, and what's in their collections, and who was the former owner of the building that houses the institution, or their personal house, or if you're really going to get into all the questions that these conversations raise, which is exactly what these people do not want to get into. He cuts through all of that and says, it's theft, pure and simple. It's like you stole a car. Don't give us this, I took it to the car show and waxed it. Did you steal it or didn't you? And I think there is something refreshing about the directness of that argument.
Well, yeah, that seems like a very German response, very direct, very kind of cutting through. But I guess the last thing I'd love to ask is, if Max Stern were alive today and we're watching this film and maybe introducing it or doing a Q&A after, what do you think he would want the lesson to be from this film about what is really his life? And I know you can't answer to that because you don't know him, but you obviously spent a lot of time with his life during the process of making this film. So what would you think would be the lesson that would really stick out to him about this film, and maybe to other people as well?
I am persuaded by the argument of the Max Stern experts in the film, such as Philip Dombowski of the National Gallery here in Ottawa, and Catherine Mackenzie, Concordia Emeritus, and so on, who suggests that Max Stern pursued restitution vigorously in his lifetime and made and collected his claims to the maximum that was possible within the highly restrictive, red tape laden, to put it very mildly, German law of the time. So I think he did his best. He did the best he could in his lifetime, and then he moved on with his life. And he was successful, and I believe that some of his successful early claims enabled him to buy the gallery that he turned into the legendary powerhouse Dominion Gallery. I think that I like to think that he would be happy with this story being told and these characters being exposed, and the fact of what he had to deal with in his lifetime, and the shocking fact that it carries on to this day. But then, is it so shocking? This is how people behave when there's money at stake, isn't it? Is going on. It was very lovely when the film premiered in Montreal last night, and an assistant who had worked in his gallery for 15 years, 17 years or something, came up to me and was moved to near tears and sort of said, I think Max Stern would have been very, very happy with this. And that was very, very gratifying, I must say. I mean, I didn't set out to make a film that Max Stern would be happy with, or necessarily a film that anybody would be happy with. I'm perfectly prepared to make only enemies in a project. It comes with the territory. Yeah. I'm trying to get to the truth of a situation, and I'm trying to, but it was very moving to have that gentleman say that to me. He's really one of the few people I've met who have seen the film who actually knew Max Stern, because even the people,
interviewed.
Yeah, the people interviewed, none of them actually knew Max Stern.
But they pretended to know a lot about
But exactly. Some after 20 years of academic research, and some after none. So it was nice, very nice hearing this from his former colleague last night.
Very cool. Well, I thank you for making this documentary. I think it's a really important story, and one there's sadly too many of, but I really enjoyed it. And thank you for coming on the show as well.
Thank you very much for having me.